in this lecture today, we are going to be going over the volunteer standards of conduct for VITA this year. So one of the first questions that you probably have is, what actually is the volunteer standards of conduct? That sounds pretty complicated. Well, really, the reason that we have the volunteer standards of conduct is that all taxpayers should be confident that their returns are being prepared both accurately and ethically by volunteers. So it's clearly very important. And the framework that we use to ensure this is the volunteer standards of conduct. And really what this means is that the volunteer standards of conduct, or as I'll refer to it often in this lecture, the VSC, because that gets very cumbersome to say it over and over again. The VSC is the core of how we think about ethical behavior in VITA and how we deal with different situations that may arise while the site is in operation. And so, along with this, before we get into specific components of the VSC, it's important to know what are the requirements that all of us as volunteers have. So the first one is that all volunteers every year must pass the VSC exam with a score of at least 80% or more. And again, like all the other exams, you get 2 opportunities to complete it. Additionally, all volunteers have to sign Form 13615, which is the Vsc Agreement, and they have to do that prior to volunteering. Basically, what that form says is that you agree to uphold the standards of the VSC. So it's very important that you sign that form along with pass your certifications. And then lastly, it's important to also note that a violation of the VSC can lead to removal from VITA and other actions. And so an important thing, though, to know with this is that this should not be too concerning to you if you're an ethical individual, because what we would consider to be a VSC violation is most often deliberate or highly negligent, not just a simple, honest mistake that you would make. And so now we need to get into what are the core components that make up the VSC, now that we've established the purpose of it. So the first one here is that we have to follow the 10 quality site requirements. And this is where we'll spend a good chunk of this lecture, is talking about what these different requirements are, because I think it's important that everyone understands the flow of a VITA site. Secondly, the next VSC component is that we cannot accept payment, solicit donations, or accept refund payments for federal or state tax return preparation from customers. It's pretty clear, we're volunteers, we have to maintain this. And then for a third standard, kind of builds off the second one in a way, we are not allowed to solicit business from taxpayers that we assist or use the information gained about them for any direct or indirect personal benefit for yourself or any other specific individual. So this is again very important. We can't profit in any way or use our positions to profit for individuals to also profit off of our roles. And so for the fourth component, this is a pretty straightforward one. Do not knowingly prepare false returns. I would think this one goes without saying, but it's still very, very important to have in here. And then fifth, do not engage in any criminal, infamous, dishonest, notoriously disgraceful conduct or any other conduct deemed to have a negative effect on the VITA program. Basically what it means here for number 5 is don't do anything that would embarrass the VITA program or get in the way of us operating our site. Then number 6, one of the most important ones here, treat all taxpayers in a professional, courteous, and respectful manner. And so getting into the first VSC component, which is the 10 quality site requirements. Going to spend a little bit of time here like I talked about earlier. So the first quality site requirement is certification. And we've talked about this a bit already in the emails that I've sent out and in the previous lectures, but all volunteers need to pass the required exams each year. And as we've talked about before, the number of exams need to pass depend on the specific role that you want to take on, which is, again, we're touching on here, volunteers who work with taxes do in fact need to pass a tax law exam. In the case of our site, that's going to be only the advanced exam. No one should pass the basic exam or have the basic level of certification. The reason for that's very simple. We want to be able to prepare advanced level returns, and additionally, we want to make it very simple for the greeter and client facilitator to know who to route returns to. So for the second QSR requirement, it revolves around the intake, interview, and quality review process. So one of the first steps in having a quality intake and interview and quality review is that each taxpayer must be given Form 13614-C to fill out prior to the start of a tax return. And this is a really important document because it serves as the guide for both the prep and review stages of a tax return. And it's where the taxpayer is going to talk about what income they have, what expenses they have, what dependents they think they can claim. And it's just a hugely important document. And then additionally, in order to have a good tax return prep, each taxpayer has to participate in an interview with the preparer, where the preparer goes over the form that we just talked about and discusses any questions that they may have about it. And then lastly, every return has to be quality reviewed by a volunteer that has proper certification. It's important that the taxpayer also engages in this quality review by a certified volunteer. So the third QSR requirement is confirming photo ID and TINs. Now it's important to understand that the requirements for photo ID and TINs, which is known as taxpayer identification numbers, are different. So for primary or secondary taxpayers, in the case that they're married filing jointly, we need a photo ID of that individual. So if a single person comes in and wants to file a return, we only need the photo ID of that single person. If a married couple that wants to file MFJ wants to have the return done by us, we need both of their IDs in order to file that return. And now for the TIN component, which is usually social security numbers or individual taxpayer identification numbers, we need those for anyone that is listed on the return. So going back to that example of a single person, if a single person comes in and they want to claim a dependent child on their return, we need the photo ID of the parent and we need some sort of taxpayer identification number for the child. So just to go over, primary and secondary taxpayers, we need the photo ID. Anyone on the tax return, including those we have photo ID for, we need social security or ITIN identification for, or any other kind of taxpayer identification number. So QSR requirement number 4, this one revolves around reference materials. And so there are some specific materials that all sites must have available for both volunteers and taxpayers. And they can be available either physically or electronically. And these are Publication 4012, the Volunteer Resource Guide. All of you will become very, very familiar with this because the Volunteer Resource Guide is basically the thing that guides us through most of our returns. And additionally, we need to have Publication 17 from the IRS, your federal income tax for individuals. Third, we need Publication 4299, Privacy, Confidentiality, Civil Rights, a Public Trust. All of those are very important to us. And then fourth, we need volunteer tax alerts and quality say requirement alerts or cyber tax alerts issued by TaxAid. Basically, those are keeping us informed on any changes that we need to be aware of or any situations we need to keep in mind. Fifth is the volunteer agreement. We've already touched on this a little bit earlier in this lecture, but all volunteers must pass the required certifications and sign Form 13615 stating that they do in fact agree to follow the VSC, and all volunteers must provide government-issued identification. So again, when you finish all of your exams and you're ready to send me all of your proof of passing those, you also need to make sure that you sign Form 13615 and provide a proof of government-issued identification. So QSR number 6 is important for everyone to understand, but this one is mainly for us, the site coordinators, to worry about, is timely filing. Site coordinators must have a process in place to file returns in a timely manner. We have that in place for both e-files, which will be the vast majority of the returns that we'll file, and traditional paper files as well. QSR number 7 relates to civil rights. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 information must be available to all taxpayers. And again, that goes back to having those reference materials posted that we need to have in the site and having this act available for them. And additionally, this is an important note that I've added here, there will be an absolute zero tolerance policy for any perceived infractions of a taxpayer's civil rights. It's something we take very seriously and is one of the foundations of our VITA program. So QSR number 8, again, this one relates largely to the site coordinators in a lot of ways, but it also is important for you when you're filling out the returns and to keep in mind, but TaxSlayer will do a lot of it for you, is that we need to make sure that we have the correct site identification number on all of the returns that we file. It would be very bad if the wrong identification number is on there in case there was an issue and then we couldn't track it down and help the taxpayer solve that. QSR number 9, we also need an EFIN. or an electronic filing number. And that correct EFIN has to be reported on all tax returns. This is what basically gives us the key to be able to file returns electronically with the IRS. So it's very important that the correct one is reported on every single return. And then lastly, for QSR number 10, security. This is really, really important. And we'll talk about this more when we actually have in-person training when we get back from break. But all sites must follow security protocols and have procedures in place to ensure that taxpayer information is protected. Obviously, our clients trust us with some really sensitive information, and so it's important that we take our responsibility seriously to maintain the integrity of that info. And again, we'll touch on that more when we have our in-person trainings, but it's just important to know that that is in fact one of the QSR requirements. And now, getting into the other parts of the VSC here. So VSC number 2 revolves around not accepting payments or refunds. So number 1, we do not under any circumstances accept payment for our services. And so that's very black and white. You can't take tips. You can't do anything like that. You can't get any payment for your services as a volunteer. That's strictly against the VSC rules. Where it gets a little more cloudy is around donations. And so that's because donations or tip jars in the preparation area are in fact a violation of the VSC. But donations can in fact be made to the sponsoring organization, but they just cannot happen in the prep area. And so, for example, if we were to have a fundraiser for Beta Alpha Psi, we couldn't have tips or a donation jar within that area, but we could in fact allow the taxpayers to donate money at a later time. And then another important point here, and it's why it is bolded, the word never, is that refunds absolutely can never be deposited into a volunteer's account. Under no circumstances should that ever occur. And then along this same line, refunds and payments should only come from accounts that have the taxpayer's name on them. And so that's another very, very important standard, is to make sure that those accounts have the taxpayer's name in order to make sure that that money is either being sent to or taken from the correct account. So VSC number 3, do not solicit business. And so the main gist of this rule is that we cannot use our role as volunteers to advance the business interests of ourselves or any others. And all taxpayer information must be confidential beyond preparing the return. So for example, if you learn something about a taxpayer that you think would benefit one of your friends' businesses, you cannot use that knowledge to help their business. And then, and this one revolves around the site coordinators largely too, when we're thinking about how we market ourselves, is that we have to secure consent from the taxpayer to disclose certain data. So VSC number 4, do not knowingly, importantly, the word here is knowingly, prepare false returns. And so volunteers must always do their best to prepare accurate returns. And the reason for this is that inaccurate returns can cause a big issue for the taxpayer. It can cause fees, a lot of hassle, and they may not in fact be able to pay all of that. And so it really can harm them if we knowingly prepare false returns. And again, here, identity theft is a serious concern. And again, as we've talked about, there will be no tolerance for anything related to identity theft. So VSC number 5, do not engage in detrimental behavior to the program, is basically what this one means. And volunteers can be removed from the program for conduct that is detrimental to VITA. And so there are many examples that you can think of as this, but one example you could think of as this is that if you get busted for stealing someone's identity, that would be conduct that would be deemed detrimental to the VITA program, and at that point you would be removed from the program and likely added to the volunteer registry, which is a registry of barred volunteers who cannot volunteer with the program anymore. So VSC number 6, and this is a really, really important one here, we should treat all taxpayers with respect. It's really the foundation of the VITA program, and I think the respect you see between the volunteers and the taxpayers is one thing that makes the VITA program really, really special. And if we do not meet this standard, we cannot perform our services well. It's really the foundation of what we do. I think it's important too that while this is specifically referring to taxpayers, we also extend this to other volunteers and we treat everyone with respect, because again, it just makes things better, and it's the only way that we can have a successful VITA program. So now that we've gone beyond the core components here of the VSC, there are some other important concepts that we need to cover. So the first one is due diligence, and this one sort of goes off the last VSC component a little bit, and it's that volunteers must do their part to ensure that information on the return is in fact correct. But one of the important components of this is that generally we as volunteers can rely on what the taxpayer tells us without documentation. But again, there's an important caveat here. This is not unlimited, and if we do think that something is wrong, it's important that we ask the site coordinator about it and talk to the taxpayer about it so that we can ensure that the return is accurately prepared. For example, if someone doesn't have any dependents listed on their return and you haven't seen any proof that they have children, but they're trying to claim a bunch of childcare expenses, probably something is up there. And so we want to clarify what that is. And so best case scenario there, talk to the taxpayer and then talk to a site coordinator about it. But again, in general, do your part to make sure everything on the return is correct. And you can rely on what the taxpayer tells us in general without documentation if it seems to check out. And so, again, we've talked about this a little bit here too, but what are some of the consequences for failing to comply with the VSC? So deliberately failing to comply with the VSC causes damages to VITA because obviously the VSC is really our ethical guide and our rule book for how we operate within VITA. And so going beyond that is going to damage the program and the taxpayers as well. Additionally, legal action can be taken if necessary, if it is deemed that that is appropriate. And importantly here, there's an email that if you see a VSC violation or an ethical violation, that you can report that to, and it's really important that you do if you see one, and that email is there on the screen in that third bullet. But, okay, so I've been scaring you a little bit probably here with a lot of the, well, there's a zero tolerance policy for everything, but it's also important to know that no one is out here to play gotcha and try to get you in anything. And one of the ways that this is brought about is through the Volunteer Protection Act. And so the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997 generally protects volunteers from liability for negligent acts they perform within the scope of their responsibilities in the organization for whom they volunteer. And importantly here, it does not protect against intentional violations of the law. And an important wording there in that definition is within the scope, because my general rule of thumb and how I think about this and why I would say that if you're an ethical individual and you're doing your best, you really should not worry about anything legally happening to you, is that generally, as long as you stay within the VSC, act ethically, and only prepare in-scope returns, you really have nothing to worry about. So again, act ethically, stay within the VSC to the best of your ability, prepare in-scope returns, and we'll be good. So, for our last couple of components here, we're going to talk about the intake and interview and quality review components of the return. And so we'll have more in-depth training on this later, but this is an overview that will help you for the VSC exam because it's important to understand the process. And so one of the things that we've talked about already is the importance of Form 13614-C, and it's absolutely essential when preparing a tax return. There are a few essential mistakes that we often see made with the form though. And one of them is that the volunteer that is preparing the tax return does not look at the information on the form. And as someone who has done return preparation and done many quality reviews, I don't honestly know how you would prepare a return without looking at this form, because this form is extremely helpful and will guide you through the return largely, but still the IRS says many volunteers do not look at this form in fact. And then secondly, the volunteer, preparer, or reviewer does not engage in a conversation about the form. So it's important there that you look over the form before you start the return and see if there are any things that you have questions about. And usually there will be, and you want to ask clarifying and probing questions of the taxpayer. So third, one of the other problems is that you'll see when you actually get the form is that in parts 1 through 5, there are specific yes or no questions that the taxpayer will answer related to things such as income and expenses. And their options are yes or no, and you often see immature or unsure also put. And so it's important that all questions are filled out as yes or no, and if the taxpayer has marked unsure, we need to find out why and get that changed to a yes or a no. And then fourthly, one of the last main issues is that there are parts of the form that need to be filled out by the preparer. And it's important the preparer does, in fact, fill out those parts of the form. And so the process here for a good intake of a taxpayer is step one, we have to greet the taxpayer. Obviously, we have a whole role dedicated to being the greeter, so it's very important. Secondly, we have to ensure that the taxpayer and the secondary taxpayer have government ID, like we've already talked about earlier. We have to verify the taxpayer's social security and or TIN information. And then 4, we have to explain the return preparation process in 2 components that we need to make sure that they understand is that they need to be interviewed by the preparer based off of the form that we were just talking about. And then B, they must participate in the quality review process with the quality reviewer. And then we need to provide them Form 13614-C, as we've been talking about through this whole thing. Should be getting a pattern here. Form 13614-C is very, very important for the taxpayer to fill out on their own and bring to the preparer. And then after that, we're going to assign them to a qualified preparer, and it will be the client facilitator in the case of our site that does that. And 2 important points with that again is that the level of certification is the highest level required based off of the answers on, again, Form 13614-C. You'll see when you actually look at the form, there are components of the form that have a B next to them. That's for basic level of certification. And there are components that have an A next to them for advanced level of certification. And again, if anything is marked A on there, it has to go to an advanced preparer. And for our site, as we've touched on already, this will not be a major issue because we will only have advanced level certifications. And this advanced level certification covers everything in the advanced and basic certification. And so now we've talked about the intake. It's important to talk about the actual interview process that a preparer should undertake when they start working with a new taxpayer. So an important point here is that only tax law certified preparers can perform the interview. So this means that only individuals in our case who have passed the advanced exam and all of their other necessary exams can participate in an interview with the taxpayer. So the first step here is to verify the taxpayer's ID. We've touched on this plenty of times. You have to verify it again, verify the ID for primary and secondary taxpayers. And then you need to review Form 13614-C again. I know it's getting repetitive, but it's a very important form. And again, all answers should be yes or no, no unsure for parts 1 through 5. And as we've talked about a little bit earlier, you need to interview and ask them probing questions to ensure the accuracy of the return, or even just go over what's on the return and make sure that they or what's on that sheet and make sure that they understand everything that they wrote down. And again, fill out the required parts and make sure that there are no out of scope items within this interview. This would hopefully be caught earlier at the greeter's desk because we'll have a system in place to catch it earlier, but you still have to be vigilant as preparer to make sure that there are no out of scope items. And then for the final stage, or close to the final stage in the return preparation process, we're going to talk about the quality review process. And so during the quality review, there are a few important things that we need to keep in mind. So basically the quality review is where we go over the work that the preparer did and make sure that the return is accurate to the best of our knowledge. So one of the first steps is that we need to invite the taxpayer to participate. Quality reviews are much better and they go much smoother when the taxpayer actively participates in it and helps the reviewer. Secondly, we need to review the return for accuracy. Again, that's really the whole point of the quality review, and it's really important that you take a critical look at the return and ensure that it is accurate. And then third, we need to double check entries in the tax software and the tax law determinations to make sure that everything that we thought should be in the return actually ends up in the return. And then lastly, we need to advise the taxpayer of their responsibility during the quality review, which is that the taxpayer is responsible for the accuracy of the information on the return, not us, because we are not paid professionals. And that is the rest of our training for the VSC. So again, as always, email me if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.